On an autumn evening in the latter years of my association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, London lay under a mantle of fog such as only that great metropolis can produce. It rolled in thick, yellow-grey folds along Baker Street, dimming the gas lamps to ghostly halos and throwing every passing cab into vague, looming shadow. Within the familiar rooms at 221B, however, there was warmth, the comforting crackle of a coal fire, and the lean, aquiline profile of my friend outlined against the blaze. Dr. John Watson, who had seen Holmes in many moods, regarded him now with a species of wary amusement. Holmes lay extended at full length upon the sofa, his dressing gown gathered loosely about him, his long hands clasped behind his head, and his eyes shut. To the uninitiated he would have appeared to be dozing, to those who knew him as Watson did. The torpor of the body was a mere blind for the utmost activity of the mind. On the table beside him lay a thin sheaf of newspapers, folded at the agony columns, and a small pile of envelopes of cheap blue paper. On the mantelpiece, in contrast, stood an exquisite Sèvres vase, recently cracked and clumsily repaired, which Mrs. Hudson had placed there that very morning with much lamentation. Holmes spoke without opening his eyes. "Pray do not smoke that particular tobacco in the house, Watson. It is the strong Turkish mixture you buy from the tobacconist in Gloucester Place, and Mrs. Hudson has endured enough for one day." Watson started, removing the unlit cigar he had been absently turning between his fingers. "Holmes, really? You did not so much as glance at me." "My dear fellow," said Holmes, opening his eyes with a languid movement, "the matter is simplicity itself. You have just come in from the street, as evidenced by the damp patch upon your left shoulder where the fog has settled. You are in evening dress, which shows you have dined out. Yet your shoes are unpolished and bear a faint smirch of sawdust. Therefore it was not at your club, but I fancy at a certain modest restaurant in Marylebone Road, whose proprietor ekes out his living by selling inferior cigars to gentlemen who ought to know better. The aroma reached me before you crossed the threshold." Watson's protest died on his lips, replaced by an involuntary smile. "You grow more insufferable with each month that passes, Holmes." "On the contrary," Holmes murmured, "I grow only more accurate." Whatever retort Watson might have framed was cut short by a sharp rap upon the door, followed at once by Mrs. P. Hudson's agitated entrance. Her usually placid face was flushed, and in her hand she held a buff-coloured envelope. "A telegram for you, sir," she said, addressing Holmes. "It's marked urgent and was brought by a boy in a great hurry. I told him you were at home, though I wish now I'd said nothing at all, for he gave me such a start, hammering at the door like the very devil." Holmes had risen in a single, sinuous motion. He took the telegram, weighed it for an instant in his hand, and then, with a quick glance at the clock upon the mantelpiece, tore it open. Watson, watching him, saw the momentary tightening of those finely cut features, the slight upward lift of the brows. "Ha!" "That exclamation, Holmes," said Watson, rising, "combined with your expression, suggests either a case or an unpaid bill." Holmes ignored the jest, his eyes moving swiftly over the penciled lines. Then he passed the flimsy sheet across to his companion. "Read that, Watson, and tell me what you make of it." The telegram bore the imprint of the Kensington Post Office and was addressed to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, London. The message ran, "Client you were to see this evening found shot dead in his study before your arrival. Stop appearances point to suicide, but certain features puzzling. Stop request your immediate attendance at once. Stop. Lestrade, Scotland Yard." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fog outside. "Good heavens," he exclaimed, "you had an appointment this evening?" "With Mr. Percival Drake, yes," Holmes replied. A ship owner of some standing connected with the Levant trade, he wrote 3 days ago, requesting a consultation upon a matter affecting his life and honour, so he phrased it. I replied that I would attend him at 9 o'clock this evening. He glanced once more at the clock. The hands stood at 10 minutes past 9. We are late, Holmes added in a tone that acknowledged the fact without apology. It appears, however, that events have outstripped even my habitual unpunctuality. Watson folded the telegram slowly. You mean? I mean, said Holmes, that a man who feared for his life is dead at the very hour he expected my protection. Lestrade believes it to be suicide, yet admits himself puzzled. That, Watson, is an invitation we cannot lightly decline. The game, if I may employ a hackneyed phrase, is most certainly afoot. In less than 10 minutes, Holmes had exchanged his dressing gown for his well-worn frock coat and Inverness cape. The deerstalker cap, which so many associate with him, he disdained for a soft felt hat more suitable to town. As they descended the stairs, he paused in the hallway, his keen eye sweeping the stand by the door. You see, Watson, our client was not entirely without determination. Leaning against the umbrella stand, half hidden behind Watson's stout walking stick, was a heavier cane of dark, polished wood with a silver knob. Holmes took it up, examined the ferrule, and turned it so that the faint initials engraved upon the top caught the light. P.D., said he, Percival Drake. He came here earlier this evening, found us absent, and went on to keep his own appointment in Kensington. Note the mud upon the ferrule, gritty with flecks of white mortar. Not the clay of Baker Street, which is more adhesive, but consistent with the new works on the west side of Hyde Park. He walked, then, not drove, despite the fog. Why should he do that? Watson asked. Holmes replaced the cane in the stand. That, my dear fellow, is one of several questions I intend to put to Mr. Drake, he said. Alas, that we must now direct them to his shade. The cab ride to Kensington was conducted in near silence. Outside, the city slid past in wavering silhouettes, the black bulk of a hansom, the fleeting glow of a cigar, the occasional shout of a driver muffled by the dense, damp air. Holmes sat with his long legs drawn up, his chin resting upon his steepled fingers, his eyes half closed. Watson, who had learned by bitter experience that such times were not suited to conversation, occupied himself with turning over the facts as he knew them, though these were at present few enough. A client who fears for his life, he mused inwardly, summons Holmes and is found dead before they can meet. Scotland Yard cries suicide, yet calls for my friend, and Holmes himself, who will fly to the most trivial oddity like a hound to the scent, is so still as to be almost ominous. The cab halted at length in a broad, respectable street, lined with tall houses whose square, darkened fronts suggested the pursed lips of propriety. A uniformed constable stood before one of the doors, his figure blurred by the fog and the wavering glow of the street lamp above him. Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his thin, ferret-like features more pinched than usual, met them in the tiled hall of the house. "I knew you'd come, Mr. Holmes," he said, with that mixture of professional pride and grudging respect which the great detective frequently inspired in him. "Nasty business, this. The doctor's with the body now." Holmes removed his gloves with deliberate care. "You are assuming a great deal, Lestrade, when you speak of a body and a suicide in the same breath," he remarked. "Where is Mr. Drake's study?" "First floor, back. This way, if you please." As they ascended the thickly carpeted staircase, Watson could not prevent his eye from wandering over the details which Holmes would, he knew, have already catalogued. The sober elegance of the furnishings, the absence of personal knick-knacks, the single portrait of a severe-looking woman in middle life which hung upon the landing. Aunt or elder sister, Watson thought, perhaps a widow. There is a certain resemblance about the eyes. Mrs. Drake, Lestrade supplied, glancing back and catching the doctor's look. The late gentleman's wife. I've put her in the drawing-room for now. She's near out of her mind with grief, though between you and me, Dr. Watson, there's something in her manner I don't altogether like. Still, you'll see for yourself later. Holmes made no comment, but Watson saw the quick bird-like turn of his head. No word spoken in his presence went unweighed. The study door stood open, a plainclothes officer stationed beside it. Within, the room was of medium size, panelled in dark wood, with a large writing desk drawn up before the window, the curtains half drawn against the fog. A coal fire burned low in the grate. On the desk, neatly arranged in a row, lay a number of papers and a heavy, silver-mounted inkstand. In the chair before the desk sat the body of a man, perhaps in his late 40s, dressed in a well-cut evening suit. His head had fallen back against the leather cushion. The hair at his temple was darkened and clotted, and upon the carpet beside the chair there was a dark, irregular stain. In his right hand, still loosely clasped, he held a revolver. The house surgeon, a florid, middle-aged practitioner, with an air of offended dignity, straightened up as they entered. "If this is Mr. Holmes," he said with a faint sniff, "he may be interested to know that the cause of death is obvious, a bullet wound to the right temple. Death would have been instantaneous." "Thank you," said Holmes absently. He had crossed the room in 3 swift strides and now stood a little to one side of the dead man, his gaze moving over every detail of the scene. Watson experienced, as he had so often before, that peculiar sensation of dislocation which occurred whenever he watched Holmes in his professional element. The familiar friend vanished. In his place stood the cold, precise reasoning machine, every faculty concentrated to a single end. Holmes's eyes lingered upon the revolver, upon the angle at which the body rested in the chair, upon the faint, powder blackening of the skin. Then they passed, quick as a lark's flight, to the desk, the papers, the inkstand, the small brass clock which ticked softly amidst the silence. He stooped to examine the dead man's hands, the cuffs of his shirt, the front of his waistcoat. Watson, who had seen many suicides as an army surgeon, could not at first detect anything amiss. The wound, the weapon, and the position of the corpse all seemed in keeping with a man who had placed the barrel to his head and fired. "Time of death, Doctor?" Lestrade asked. The local surgeon cleared his throat. "I was called in at 20 minutes to 9. I should place death not more than half an hour before that, perhaps a quarter, allowing for the condition of the body." "You are sure?" Holmes inquired without looking up. "As sure as any man may be, sir, without a post-mortem." Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. "And yet," he murmured, more to himself than to the others, "our client's cane stands in Baker Street, and the mud upon its ferrule is hardly dry." Watson opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. There was indeed something strange in the juxtaposition of those facts, but he could not follow his friend's line of thought. Lestrade, meanwhile, was consulting his notebook. "Mr. Percival Drake, shipowner," the inspector recited. "Age 48, married, no children, found by his butler, one James Harker, at 10 minutes past 8. The household heard a single shot. Door was locked on the inside, no sign of a struggle. Revolver in the deceased's hand. Under ordinary circumstances, I'd say it was clear enough, Mr. Holmes, but, well, there are 1 or 2 points." "There usually are," said Holmes. "Pray continue." Lestrade hesitated, then gestured toward the desk. "For one thing, there's that." Upon the blotter, partly covered by the dead man's left hand, lay a single sheet of paper. The fingers had smudged the ink, but the words were still legible. Watson read them aloud. "I can bear this no longer. Better to end it myself than face the dishonour that is coming. Forgive me." There was no signature. "A suicide note," said the local doctor, with a certain finality. "Is it?" Holmes murmured. He moved to the desk and, with a delicate touch of his long fingers, eased the stiffening hand from the paper. For an instant his gaze rested upon the lines, then shifted to the blotter beneath and the back of the page. His nostrils flared slightly, like those of a hound catching a fresh scent. Watson, watching, saw his friend's eyes momentarily brighten. It was the sort of subtle change that would have passed unnoticed by any but one who knew him intimately, but to Watson it was as clear as if Holmes had cried aloud. Holmes folded the paper once and slipped it into his pocket. "I shall require to examine this more closely in good light," he said. "You are content to trust me with it, Lestrade?" The inspector shrugged. "If it helps you make sense of this business, Mr. Holmes, you're welcome to it. But I can't see what's puzzling you. The man was in trouble, financial or otherwise, left a note, shot himself. That's the long and short of it to my mind. The only thing that doesn't quite fit is the wife." "The wife?" "Yes. She insists that her husband was expecting you, Mr. Holmes, and that he had some enemy who meant him harm. She's got it into her head that this was murder." Holmes's gaze had drifted to the small brass clock upon the desk. He lifted it, turned it over, and then set it back with a little click. "An enemy," he repeated softly. "A locked room, a revolver in the dead man's hand, a note which speaks of dishonour, and a client who, if your surgeon is to be believed, was dead at the very hour he expected my help." He turned to Watson, and in his eyes there flickered that cold, keen flame which boded ill for any man whose secret he chose to uncover. "Tell me, Watson," he said, "do you find it a simple matter to kill yourself before the moment you have resolved upon the deed?" Watson stared at him, bewildered. "I don't understand, Holmes." "Nor do I. Yet," replied Sherlock Holmes. "But I hope that before this fog lifts from London, it may also lift from this singular case, for there is something here, my dear fellow, which offends my very soul. Lestrade," he added, turning back to the inspector, "be so good as to introduce me to Mrs. Drake. It is time we heard the living speak for the dead." With that, and one last swift glance about the room, a glance that lingered, Watson noticed, upon the cracked glass of the window and a faint smear upon the brass door handle, Holmes strode toward the door, the long shadow of his figure thrown forward into the dimly lit corridor beyond. The case of the man who was killed before Holmes arrived had begun. Mrs. Drake was seated in a high-backed chair in the drawing-room, her figure framed by the heavy curtains that shut out the fog-laden night. The room was lit by a pair of shaded lamps, whose mellow glow fell upon a face that might once have been handsome, now drawn and sharpened by grief, or what passed for it. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair drawn severely back, and eyes that glittered too brightly for Watson's medical taste. A handkerchief lay crushed in her fingers, but there were no tears upon it. She rose as Holmes entered, and for an instant her gaze fixed itself upon him with a sort of desperate hope. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she asked. Holmes inclined his head. "I am. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. Pray be seated, Mrs. Drake. I fear that this is a cruel time to trouble you with questions, but the interests of truth and justice admit of no delay." She sank back into her chair, clasping her hands together so tightly that the knuckles showed white through the skin. "Truth," she repeated in a low voice. "Yes, truth. They are all saying it was my husband's own hand They show me that dreadful paper on his desk. They tell me he was ashamed, that he preferred death to disgrace. But they are wrong, Mr. Holmes. You must see that they are wrong." "What leads you to that conclusion, madam?" Holmes asked. Taking a seat where the lamplight fell sidewise across her face, Watson, a little behind and to one side, took mental note of the quick rise and fall of her breast, the tension in the muscles of the jaw. Strong emotions were at play here, but of what kind he could not as yet be sure. "My husband was not a coward," she said. "He has met reverses in business before and borne them calmly. He was not a man to fling away his life because of a bad quarter's figures, and besides, he had written to you. He told me of it. Holmes will see me through this," he said. "If any man can, it is he." "Does that sound like one who would choose death?" Holmes steepled his fingers, his eyes never leaving the woman's face. "You knew then that he feared for his life?" Her lips trembled. "He did not say so in those words." But there was a change. He was anxious, watchful. Twice in the last week I woke to find him standing by the window in the dark, listening to the street. He started at any unusual sound. When I questioned him, he laughed it off. "Merely business worries, my dear," he said. But I knew better. A wife always knows. "There is some truth in the saying," Holmes murmured. "Tell me, Mrs. Drake, had your husband any enemies? Men with whom he had quarrelled, perhaps, or who might have suffered loss through his actions?" She hesitated, and in that pause Watson fancied he caught the faintest flicker of something, reluctance or calculation, pass across her face. "He was a ship owner, Mr. Holmes," she said at last. "In such a trade it is impossible to please everyone. Merchants complain of delays, captains grumble at their pay. But an enemy? Someone who would wish him dead?" She shook her head slowly. "No, there is no one I can think of." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "No one at all? Come, madam, reflect. A dismissed employee, a rival in business, a man whom Mr. Drake may have bested in some deal." "There is Mr. Adrian Spence," she said reluctantly. "They had words last month over the sale of a vessel. Mr. Spence believed himself unfairly treated. He left the house in anger and has not returned since. But that is business, nothing more. Men say sharp things when money is at stake. They do not commit murder." "Sometimes they do," Holmes said with a chill brevity. "Mr. Spence is in the same line of trade, I gather?" "Yes, his offices are in the city." Holmes noted the name in his pocketbook with a swift motion. "And within the household?" he continued. "Your servants, are they old retainers, or recently engaged? Our butler, Harker, has been with us 5 years, the housemaid and cook only the last 12 months. They are all respectable people, Mr. Holmes. Surely you do not suspect that any of them—" "I suspect nothing," Holmes answered. "I merely collect facts. When did you last see your husband alive?" She closed her eyes a moment, and when she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "After luncheon. He went out to his offices at 2 o'clock. I did not see him again until they told me he was—" Her voice broke upon the word. "Harker says he returned a little after 7 and went straight to his study. He sent no message to me. I thought—" Her lips twisted faintly. "I thought he was merely tired." "You did not go to him?" "No. We have lived somewhat separate lives of late, Mr. Holmes. His business absorbed him. He was often closeted in that room for hours. I had learned not to intrude when he wished to be alone." Holmes' eyes were unreadable. "And you heard the shot?" "Yes, a single report. I was in my bedroom on the floor above. Harker called up the stairs that something dreadful had happened, and when I came down—" She shuddered,
and for the first time genuine tears brimmed over and slipped down her cheeks. They would not let me into the room at first. Harker tried to keep me out, but I forced my way past him. My husband was sitting in that chair. There was blood, and the pistol. Oh, Mr. Holmes. She pressed the handkerchief to her mouth to stifle a sob. Holmes leaned forward a fraction. When you entered?
Was the position of the body as it is now? He asked softly. Think carefully, Mrs. Drake. Had anything been moved? She dabbed at her eyes, struggling for composure. I believe it was the same. The chair, I think it was turned a little more toward the fire, but I may be mistaken. Everything swam before my eyes. The note? No, the note was there on the desk. I saw it at once. Harker tried to draw me away, but I snatched it up and read it. That was when I knew they would say he had killed himself. But I tell you, Mr. Holmes, I do not believe it. I will never believe it. Holmes rose slowly. Your conviction does you credit, madam, he said. Whether it is justified is a matter for investigation, not sentiment. One last question for the present. Are you aware of the contents of your husband's letter to me? No.
He did not show it to me, nor of the nature of the dishonour to which he alludes in that note upon the desk. She shook her head, bewildered. Dishonour? Then he wrote of it, yes, said Holmes. But whether that note is genuine, or when it was written, are questions upon which I am not yet prepared to speak. I must ask you, Mrs. Drake, to hold yourself at the disposal of the police, and not to leave the house without informing Inspector Lestrade. You may rest assured that I shall devote my best efforts to uncovering the truth of your husband's death. She caught his hand in both of hers with sudden fervour. God bless you, Mr. Holmes. If there is any justice in heaven or earth, you will find it. When they had withdrawn to the hall, Lestrade, who had hovered discreetly out of earshot, drew closer. Well, Mr. B?
Holmes? He asked in a low voice. What do you make of her? Holmes took up his hat from the table, dusting an invisible speck from the brim. I make of her, he said, a woman who is very anxious that we should believe in her husband's courage and in her own ignorance. Whether she is equally anxious to tell us the whole truth is another matter. Come, Watson, before we leave this house there is a person I wish to see more than any other. The butler? Watson suggested. Precisely. When tragedy stalks a respectable household, it generally finds the butler already at the scene. Let us have a word with James Harker. If this is, as you think, a straightforward case of suicide, Lestrade, his story will confirm it. If it is not... Holmes' grey eyes glinted. Then perhaps the man who found the body saw more than he has yet chosen to say. Harker was waiting in the narrow passage near the servants' quarters, a stiff, angular figure whose every line suggested long service and carefully mastered propriety. He stood with his back very straight, hands clasped before him, his sombre livery immaculate, despite the evening's ordeal. Yet Watson, with a physician's eye, saw the twitch of a muscle in the man's jaw, the slightly glassy sheen in his eyes. Shock, yes, but mixed with something else. Fear, perhaps. Holmes regarded him with polite interest, though Watson could sense the sharper, colder scrutiny beneath. "You are James Harker, I believe," Holmes said. "I understand you were the first to discover your master's condition." "Yes, sir," Harker replied, his voice deep but subdued. "It was I who found him. A terrible sight, sir. I hope never to see the like again. You will oblige me by recounting exactly what occurred," Holmes said. "Begin with your master's return home this evening." Harker bowed his head slightly as though arranging the facts in his mind. "Mr. Drake returned at a little after 7 o'clock, sir. He let himself in with his key, as he often did. I was in the pantry at the time and heard the front door open. When I went to attend him, he was already on the stairs. He nodded to me, but said nothing. I could see he was troubled, sir, very troubled. He walked straight to his study and closed the door. "Did he lock it?" Holmes asked gently. "I cannot say with certainty, sir. I did not hear a key turn, but I was not standing close enough to be sure." "And he sent no instructions? Ordered no dinner?"
Requested no one to disturb him? No, sir. It was not unusual for him to take a late supper, or none at all. Holmes inclined his head. Continue. Harker swallowed once, his Adam's apple rising and falling sharply. It was at about 10 minutes past 8 that I heard the shot, sir. A single report. It came from the study. I knew at once something was wrong. I ran to the door, tried the handle, and found it locked. I knocked and called out to Mr. Drake, but there was no answer. Mrs. Drake came from upstairs, and I feared she would see what I suspected. I fetched a small key from my pocket, one I keep for emergencies, sir, in case Mr. Drake should lock himself in accidentally. Holmes lifted an eyebrow. You possess a key capable of opening the lock on your master's study? Yes, sir. By Mr. Drake's own instruction.
He was a man who valued privacy, but he told me long ago that if anything should happen, if he should fall ill or be taken unawares, I must be able to reach him. Holmes' expression did not change, but Watson saw his fingers tap, once against the side of his leg. "And when you entered?" Holmes prompted. Harker drew a deep breath. "He was sitting in the chair, just as you saw him, sir. The pistol. The blood." His composure wavered momentarily, and Watson felt a flicker of sympathy. Whatever the man's faults, he had been loyal to his master. "Mrs. Drake forced her way past me, sir. I tried to spare her the sight, but she would not be deterred." Holmes stepped a fraction closer, his voice softening in a way that Watson recognized as deliberate. "Harker, look at me a moment. When you entered the room, did anything strike you as out of place? Anything at all, however trivial?" Harker's brow creased. He stared at the floor as if searching the tiles for memory. I thought the curtains were drawn more tightly than usual, sir. Mr. Drake disliked a dark room, but perhaps I misremember. Everything happened so quickly." Holmes nodded as though filing this away. "And the note? Did you see it before Mrs. Drake picked it up?" "I did, sir. It lay on the desk. I saw the writing, his writing, I believe, though I do not know what it said." Holmes removed his gaze from the man and seemed about to turn away, but then paused. "One last inquiry, Harker. Has anyone visited Mr. Drake within the last 2 days apart from his regular business associates? Any stranger, any person unknown to you?" A faint shiver, so faint Watson might have imagined it, passed through the butler's shoulders. "No, sir, no strangers." Holmes studied him for a breath, then gave a slight bow of the head. "Very good. I am obliged to you, Harker. You have been helpful. You may return to your duties for now." The man withdrew with a relieved nod, though not before Watson caught a fleeting glance he cast toward the darkened study door, a look almost haunted. When he was out of earshot, Watson turned to Holmes. "Well, Holmes, what do you make of him?" Holmes placed his hands behind his back and began pacing slowly along the passage, his steps silent on the thick carpet. "A precise and well-rehearsed account," he said. "Every detail correct, I do not doubt, correct in the sense that it conforms exactly to the narrative he wishes to convey." "You suspect him, then?" "I suspect everyone, Watson, until I have reason to do otherwise." Holmes stopped abruptly, his gaze returning with burning intensity toward the stairway they had descended earlier. "There is something profoundly amiss here. A man writes to me seeking help. He walks to Baker Street, leaves his cane, goes on to his home. Within an hour, he is dead. It could be coincidence, Watson ventured. Holmes gave a short, mirthless laugh. In my experience, Watson, coincidence is merely the safer word men use when they fear to admit the presence of design. Lestrade approached at that moment, rubbing his hands together in the manner of one eager to be proved right. "Well, Mr. Holmes, the butler says exactly what I expected. The door was locked. The man was alone. He left a note. Isn't it time we called this what it is?" "Not yet, Lestrade," Holmes said crisply. "There are details that trouble me. The time of death, for one."
"The state of the window, for another." "The window?" Watson asked. Holmes began walking toward the study once more, speaking in a low tone they were compelled to follow. "You observed the crack in the glass, Watson? A hairline fracture in the lower pane radiating outward, too clean, too precise to be accidental. And the smear on the brass handle, did you not note it?" "I noticed something, but I did not examine it closely." "Human perspiration mixed with soot," Holmes said. "Fresh. Someone opened that window recently, and not, I think, Mr. Drake. He was sitting at his desk. His shoes showed no recent dusting. His left cuff bore ink, not soot. And the curtains were half drawn when by habit he kept them wide." Lestrade frowned. "But the door was locked. Harker needed a key to enter." "Indeed," Holmes said gravely.
Which suggests one of two possibilities. Either the killer had access to a duplicate key, or Mr. Drake was already dead when the door was last locked. Watson's breath caught. "You mean someone could have staged the scene?" "A possibility, no more. But note, Watson, how neatly every element presents itself. A man with supposed financial trouble, a perfect suicide note placed where the eye is drawn, a pistol in the right hand, a locked room, a dutiful servant who can attest to his master's melancholy." Lestrade sputtered. "You cannot seriously think—" "What I think," Holmes interrupted, "is that we know too much. A true suicide often leaves uncertainty, doubt. But this," he gestured toward the silent room, "has the air of a performance." He turned suddenly toward the staircase, his voice decisive. "Lestrade, allow no one to leave this house until you have taken their statements in full. Watson, fetch your coat. There is a man in the city I must speak with before midnight." "You mean Adrian Spence?" "Just so. If Drake had an enemy bold enough to threaten him, that man will not be sleeping soundly tonight." "And Mrs. Drake?" Watson asked quietly. "Do you trust her account?" Holmes paused only a fraction. "I trust that she told us what she wished us to believe. Whether she told us the truth is another matter entirely." The gas lamps in the hall flickered as a gust of fog pressed against the window panes, and Holmes, his cape swirling behind him, moved toward the door with that swift, predatory purpose Watson knew so well. The night outside seemed darker now, heavier with a tension that had not been present before. The investigation had ceased to be merely curious. It was now unmistakably perilous. The fog hung still more thickly over the streets as Holmes and Watson emerged from the Drake residence, the night pressing close around them like damp wool. Their cab had been dismissed earlier, and Holmes, with a sharp gesture to Watson, set off at once down the pavement at a brisk pace. The lamps glowed faintly through the mist, each a blurred halo that cast more shadow than light. It was nearly 9:30, yet the city seemed muffled, as though London itself were holding its breath. Holmes walked swiftly, his long strides cutting through the gloom with unwavering certainty. Watson kept close beside him, his mind turning over the events of the past hour. The echo of Mrs. Drake's wavering voice, the pallor in Harker's features, The grim tableau of the study, they were threads, loose and tangled. Holmes, however, already seemed to see the pattern they might form. "You believe Spence will still be at his offices at this hour?" Watson asked at last, breaking the silence. Holmes inhaled deeply, the cold air condensing as a faint plume before him. "I believe, Watson, that guilty men sleep poorly, and that men who fear they may be implicated in another's death sleep not at all. But if he is innocent?" Holmes's lips curled faintly. "Then he will merely consider me an inconvenience rather than a threat. A difference which, in my experience, reveals itself swiftly enough." They had reached a broader thoroughfare where cabs still clattered by in dull procession. Holmes hailed one with a sharp whistle and gave the driver an address near Fenchurch Street. The hansom lurched forward, wheels hissing against the wet cobbles. The ride was spent in silence, save for the occasional rattle of harness or distant cry from some unseen direction. Holmes, with his chin sunk upon his chest, appeared lost in thought. Yet Watson could sense the quick movement of his mind, the subtle tightening of his fingers, the restless shift of his gaze whenever the cab passed beneath one of the lamps. "Holmes," Watson said quietly, "you spoke earlier of the possibility that Drake was dead before the door was locked. How could that be accomplished without alerting the household?" Holmes did not lift his head. "By familiarity, Watson. A stranger who enters a house raises suspicion, but a man who is expected or who has cause to be there might pass without notice. Consider Harker's account. He heard no argument, no raised voice, a single shot only, yet Drake's demeanor earlier suggests he expected danger. You think he admitted his killer willingly? Or that the killer already had access?" Holmes replied. "Remember the key, Watson. A domestic servant may possess one duplicate. A murderer might possess another." Watson frowned. But who would have such access? A member of the household? "Or someone trusted intimately enough to be allowed near Drake's private affairs?" Holmes murmured. "The locked door tells us not of solitude, but of concealment. The question is, concealment by whom?" Before Watson could form a reply, the cab slowed and stopped at the corner of a narrow street lined with respectable commercial buildings. Though most were dark at this hour, one window showed a faint glow from within. Holmes paid the driver and strode toward it without hesitation. The brass plate beside the door read Adrian Spence and Cober, Shipping Brokers. Holmes rapped sharply upon the panelled wood. After a moment, footsteps approached, and the door opened a scant 6 inches, revealing a tall, angular man with narrowed eyes and a cautious manner. "Yes?" "The office is closed for the evening." Holmes held up his card. "Sherlock Holmes, I believe you conducted business with Mr. Percival Drake." The man's face altered instantly. The guarded suspicion gave way to a flicker of surprise, then something else, unease, perhaps. "Holmes," Spence repeated. "Yes, I know your name. You are the detective." Holmes stepped forward subtly, obliging the man to widen the door. "Your memory serves you well. May we come in?" Spence hesitated only a moment longer before yielding. The office was tidy, furnished in dark mahogany and smelling faintly of ink and old ledgers. A single gas lamp burned upon a clerical desk, casting long shadows across the floor. Spence gestured brusquely toward 2 chairs. "If this is about business, I must warn you I have had a long day." "It is about Mr. Drake," Holmes said quietly. Spence froze. His shoulders tightened, and he gave a stiff, mechanical nod. "I heard there was some incident at his house." Holmes regarded him steadily. "You heard?" Spence avoided the gaze. "Yes, a messenger from the Yard came earlier, making inquiries about certain financial dealings. I assumed the worst." Holmes leaned forward. Mr. Spence, Percival Drake is dead, shot in his study, some hours ago. Spence's sharp intake of breath was not feigned. Watson could recognize genuine shock when he saw it. The colour drained from the man's face, leaving it a pale, greyish hue. "Dead! Drake, but good God, how?" "That is precisely what I intend to determine," Holmes said. "There was a note suggesting suicide, but there are features of the scene which render that conclusion doubtful." Spence sank into the nearest chair, his composure cracking. "I quarrelled with him," he muttered. "Yes, I admit it. But I never wished him dead. Our dispute was business. Hard words, nothing more." Holmes watched him with the stillness of a hawk poised above its prey. "You had no dealings with him today?" "None. I have not seen him since the quarrel last month." "Did he owe you money, or you him?" "A small matter, insignificant in comparison to his holdings," Spence said, irritation creeping into his voice. "Holmes, I am not your villain. Drake and I locked horns frequently, but we respected each other." "If there is foul play, and from your tone I gather there may be, it was not by my hand." Holmes tapped a finger lightly upon the table. "Tell me, Mr. Spence, did you know of anyone who may have wished him harm? Anyone who might have coerced or threatened him?" Spence hesitated. "There was talk," he said slowly. "Rumours circulating among the brokers. Something about an unfortunate investment, one that Drake regretted deeply. A ship he purchased, the Adelaide Star, was said to be linked to a scandal overseas." Holmes's eyes brightened. "What manner of scandal?" "Illegal cargo," Spence said, his voice dropping. "Contraband, if the whispers are true." Drake claimed ignorance of the matter, but some believed he had been deceived. Others thought he was complicit. "Did Drake speak to you of this?" "Only once," Spence replied. "He hinted that he was being pressured by someone connected with the affair, an unseen party who had leverage over him, but he would not name them. I dismissed it as exaggeration. Now I am less certain." Holmes rose with the sudden decision of a man who has heard exactly what he sought. "Your candour is noted, Mr. Spence. It may yet prove of value to you." Spence stood as well, confusion and worry etched deep into his lined features. "If you find who did this," he said earnestly, "you will have done a service to more than Drake's memory. There is rot in our trade, Mr. Holmes. Drake knew it. Perhaps someone feared what he might reveal." Holmes paused at the door.
"I seldom rely on conjecture, Mr. Spence, but tonight yours aligns with the direction my own inquiries suggest. If my suspicions are correct, Drake's death was not the end of his troubles, only the silencing of his voice." Outside, the fog had thickened into a clammy shroud. Watson felt a tremor of unease as Holmes stepped into the street with renewed purpose. "You have a plan, Holmes?" "I have the beginning of one," Holmes said. "A man threatened, a scandal buried, a death staged to resemble despair. These are not isolated facts, Watson. They are fragments of a design. And now we must return to Baker Street." "Tonight?" "Tonight," Holmes replied firmly. "There is something in that note that requires careful examination, and the sooner we understand when it was written,
"The sooner we shall know who wished Percival Drake dead." He turned sharply toward the murky silhouette of an approaching cab, and Watson followed, sensing with every step that the true peril of the case was only now beginning to emerge from the fog. The fog seemed thicker still when they reached Baker Street, the lamps glowing like blurred embers in the murk. Holmes paused only briefly to pay the driver, then ascended the steps of 221B, two at a time. Watson followed, shedding his overcoat in the hallway as Holmes threw aside his own with uncharacteristic haste. The atmosphere in the sitting room, usually a haven of warmth and familiarity, felt charged tonight, as though the air itself braced for revelation. Holmes lit 2 lamps, their glow slicing through the gloom, then strode to the table and withdrew the folded sheet of paper taken from Drake's desk. With the delicacy of a surgeon exposing a vital organ, he placed it upon the blotter. His eyes gleamed with an energy Watson had seen only in moments when the mind of Sherlock Holmes, razor-sharp, relentless, was locked upon the scent of truth. "Watson," he said, "observe." Watson leaned closer. The message, written in neat but slightly hurried strokes, still carried the stark finality of a man's last words. "I can bear this no longer. Better to end it myself than face the dishonor that is coming. Forgive me." "You will note," Holmes continued, "that the ink is quite dry, yet the writing bears none of the rigidness one would expect from recent distress. The lines flow too smoothly, perhaps, but most importantly—" He lifted the paper by its top corner, angling it toward the lamplight. Watson peered more closely, and then saw what Holmes meant. The faintest shadow of script bled upward from the underside, not from Drake's writing, but from the blotter impressions behind it. "A previous message," Watson murmured. "One that bled through." Holmes tapped the paper lightly. "Precisely. The blotter beneath retained marks of a different hand, one writing with greater pressure. See the slope, the short downstrokes? This note does not match them." "You mean," Watson said slowly, "that this could have been copied?" "Or forged," Holmes replied. "The two are not mutually exclusive." Before Watson could argue the implications, Holmes set the note aside and reached for a magnifying lens. He examined the edges of the paper, the density of the ink upon the curves of certain letters, the faint abrasions where the quill had hesitated. "This paper is from a different batch than the stationery found on Drake's desk, slightly thinner. The watermark, look here, shows a manufacturer in Bristol. Drake's writing sheets, by contrast, were purchased from a stationer in Kensington. I observed the envelope he sent me 2 days ago. The paper is of entirely different fibre." Watson felt his pulse quicken. "Then the note was planted." Holmes nodded once. "Drake may never have penned these words. Someone wished us to believe that he had accepted his own shame." "Lestrade will not welcome this idea," Watson muttered. "Lestrade will welcome whatever eliminates confusion from his desk," Holmes said dryly. "Though for the present I prefer he remain in a state of benign ignorance. It will prevent the true culprit from realizing the net is tightening." Holmes turned away from the table and began pacing, his movements sharp and restless. "Consider, Watson, Drake wrote to me requesting help, yet the note in his study speaks not of seeking aid, but of surrendering to disgrace. Why reach out only to abandon hope? The contradiction is too great." Watson watched him, the long fingers laced behind his back, the rhythmic tapping of his foot. "You think," Watson said, "that Drake learned something tonight, something so grave that his enemies acted at once?" Holmes stopped abruptly. "Not learned, Watson, confirmed. Those who wished him silenced feared I might uncover what they had done. Drake may have met someone before returning home, someone who gave him proof of the danger he faced." "And yet he walked to Baker Street," Watson said thoughtfully. "Why walk and not take a cab?" "Because he wished to see whether he was followed," Holmes said quietly. "Nothing reveals a tale more effectively than moving on foot through the fog. And tell me, was tonight not ideal for such concealment?" Watson felt a chill pass over him. "Then the killer shadowed him?" "Almost certainly. They saw him leave us his cane. They feared he had already confided in me. In truth, Drake accomplished nothing more than alerting his adversary to the urgency of their task. Holmes resumed pacing, each turn more measured than the last. "There is another matter," he said, pausing once more at the table. "The time of death. Harker found the body shortly after 8. The surgeon placed death a half-hour before that, yet the mud on Drake's cane was still damp when I examined it at 9. Even allowing for the fog's moisture, that mud originated from fresh mortar, material that dries quickly when exposed." Watson stared at him. "Holmes, are you suggesting Drake was alive later than the surgeon believes?" Holmes gave a thin smile. The good doctor's estimate was not unreasonable, but it was convenient for someone who wished to conceal the true timeline. If Drake returned at 7, met his killer shortly after, and died within minutes, then why does every detail, from the rigidity of the fingers to the state of the hearth, suggest a later death? The hearth? Holmes nodded toward the memory of the Drake study. There was a faint heat still radiating from the grate. An ordinary fire cools within half an hour unless stoked, and yet that fire bore recent disturbance. Watson felt the pieces sliding into place. Then Drake died closer to 8 than 7:30. "And perhaps even nearer to 8:30, Holmes said quietly. "Meaning the killer remained in that room long enough to attempt his staging with care. The note placed, the curtains drawn, the pistol arranged, and then—" He halted. The door locked behind him. Watson felt his breath falter. "But how, Holmes? How could anyone lock the door from the inside?" Holmes's expression grew distant, the way it did when he was contemplating a labyrinth only he could yet perceive. "There are methods," he murmured. "A string through the keyhole, a duplicate key, a simple manipulation of the tumblers. But the simplest explanation is also the most likely." Watson leaned forward. "Which is?" "That the door was not locked by the killer," Holmes said, turning sharply toward him, "but by the man who found the body." Watson recoiled. "Harker, the butler? Or someone acting in concert with him? His story was too smooth, too ready, his shot too carefully measured. He had a key, Watson, a key that opens the one room a killer most needs to access, and he alone claims to have heard the shot." "But you think the shot may have been staged?" Watson asked. "Staged or timed for effect," Holmes said. "A single report that conveniently summoned the household to the scene. Yet no servant ventured near earlier, no matter what sounds or movements may have occurred." He turned back to the note and tapped it once, decisively. "This note tells us who wished to fabricate despair. The timeline tells us who had opportunity, and the window, the soot on the brass, tells us someone else used that exit." Watson stiffened. "Exit? I thought—" Holmes lifted a finger. "Tonight, Watson, we return to the Drake residence." Watson blinked. "Tonight? Again?" "Indeed, because I believe," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing with that fierce, hawk-like intensity Watson knew so well, "that someone besides Drake and his killer entered that study, someone who relied on the fog for concealment, someone who opened that window, perhaps to pass a message or receive one." He extinguished one lamp, leaving the room cast in deepening shadow. "And if I am correct, Watson, then the killer is not done yet. They have silenced Drake, but there are others who may know fragments of the truth. And such men, Watson, seldom leave loose ends." Watson felt the weight of the case settle over them both like the fog beyond the window. Holmes reached for his coat. "We must go at once," he said, "for if we do not arrive in time, we may find that the next witness has already been conveniently removed." With that, Holmes swept toward the door, and Watson followed, the cold night awaiting them once more. The fog had thickened to a damp, suffocating blanket by the time Holmes and Watson reached Kensington once more. The lamps glowed like dim, floating orbs in the murk, and the silhouettes of passing figures dissolved almost instantly into the haze. Holmes moved swiftly, never hesitating, his cape trailing behind him like the shadow of his own urgency. Watson kept pace, his thoughts racing ahead of him in grim anticipation. If Holmes was correct, and Watson had long since learned the futility of assuming otherwise, then someone within that house was in immediate danger. Holmes slowed as they approached the Drake residence, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the facade. A single lamp burned in an upstairs window, the drawing room. Lestrade's men still patrolled the entrance, their figures barely visible through the gloom. Holmes held up a hand to signal Watson to stop before they stepped fully into view. For several seconds he stood perfectly still, listening. "Holmes," Watson whispered. "There," Holmes murmured. "Do you hear it?" Watson strained his ears, but heard only the deep, muffled quiet of the fog-shrouded street. "A faint, metallic scrape," Holmes said softly. "Not from the door. Higher. A window latch, perhaps." "Come." He moved swiftly along the low garden wall, skirted the side of the house, and stopped beneath the study window, the very one whose cracked pane had intrigued him earlier. Watson peered upward just in time to see the faintest glow of light from within, filtered weakly through the heavy curtains. But it was not the crack in the glass that drew Holmes's attention. It was the small imprint in the soil below the sill. He knelt at once, examining it under the weak spill of light. "A footprint," Watson whispered. Holmes shook his head. "Not quite. The heel is too shallow, the forepart too narrow. Someone stood here, Watson, on tiptoe, reaching upward, and judging from the angle, attempting either to catch or to deliver something through that window." Watson swallowed hard. A message or an object? But whatever it was,
The exchange was hurried. "Look, there is another mark, smudged, as though the person slipped." He straightened abruptly. "We must get inside." The constable at the door stiffened as Holmes and Watson emerged from the side of the house, but Holmes merely flashed the yard's own authority in his tone. "Inspector Lestrade is within?" "Yes, sir. First floor." He ordered all doors watched. "Excellent. Continue your post." Holmes swept inside, Watson close behind. The atmosphere in the entrance hall felt heavier than before, charged with a tension that seemed to vibrate faintly through the walls. Lestrade appeared at the landing above, his face pinched with irritation, until he saw who had entered. "Holmes, what brings you back? I thought you were finished for the night." "I fear the events of this evening are far from concluded," Holmes said. "Where is Mrs. Drake?" "In her room," Lestrade replied. "I posted a constable outside. She's not to be disturbed." "And the servants?" "Questioned and sent to their quarters, except the butler."
"He's in the kitchen. Why? What's happened?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he moved quickly past Lestrade, heading straight for the study. Watson followed, heart pounding. When they reached the threshold, Holmes halted, scanning the room with a swift, hawk-like sweep of his gaze. Nothing appeared altered, yet Holmes stiffened. "Watson," he whispered, "look there." At first Watson saw nothing amiss. Then his eye caught the faint disturbance Holmes had noticed. The curtain by the window hung at a sharper angle than before, its hem slightly crumpled. Someone had touched it recently. Holmes crossed the room in 3 strides and examined the window latch. "Moved," he murmured. "Someone attempted to open it." Lestrade joined them, irritation giving way to alarm. "Holmes, you must tell me what you expect to find." Holmes turned to him with sudden intensity. "Inspector, where is Harker?" In the kitchen, as I told you. We go to him now, quickly. Holmes swept out of the study, Lestrade and Watson following close behind. Down the stairs they moved, past the dimly lit hall and toward the servants' passage. But before they reached the kitchen door, Holmes slowed, lifted a hand, and pressed a finger to his lips. A faint sound carried through the wood, something between a groan and a muffled gasp. Holmes did not knock. He threw the door open. The kitchen was dim, lit by a single low-burning lamp. Harker sat slumped in a chair near the table, his head bowed unnaturally, his hands limp at his sides. A mug lay tipped over beside him, its contents spilled across the floor. Watson was at his side in an instant, checking the man's pulse. Holmes hovered only a step behind, his expression unreadable. "He's alive," Watson said. "Barely, pulse weak. Holmes, this is poisoning." Lestrade swore under his breath. "Poisoning? But who—" "Someone who feared he knew too much," Holmes said calmly. "Or that he might speak more freely upon our return." Watson examined the mug. "There's a bitter smell, almond perhaps, cyanide." "Something akin to it," Holmes said. Enough to silence him quickly, yet not instantly. We arrived just in time to ensure his last words may yet be heard. Holmes bent low, his voice firm but quiet. "Harker, can you hear me?" The butler's eyelids fluttered, a faint tremor passed through his lips. Holmes leaned closer.
"You must tell us. Who did this? Who came to you?" Harker's throat worked painfully. His breath rattled in his chest. "It wasn't suicide," he whispered. "We know that," Holmes said. "Tell me who forced you to lie." Harker's eyes shifted fearfully toward the doorway. Watson turned but saw only darkness there. "Harker," Holmes pressed. "You must say the name. Who killed your master?" The butler's fingers twitched. He tried to lift his hand, and Holmes guided it gently. With a trembling effort, Harker formed a single word, barely audible, a breath shaped into sound. Holmes bent closer. The whisper came again, this time clear enough for all three men to hear. "In the house?" Watson felt a shiver crawl up his spine. Holmes's voice dropped to a razor edge. "Who in the house, Harker? Who?" But the man's breath faltered. His muscles slackened.
His head fell to the side. Watson felt for a pulse and found none. He stood slowly, his face pale. "He's gone, Holmes." Lestrade's jaw clenched. "Someone here in this house poisoned him?" Holmes turned sharply toward the doorway, his eyes ablaze. "Inspector," he said, "unless we act at once, the killer will strike again." A floorboard creaked faintly overhead. Holmes lifted his head, every muscle taut. "They are not fleeing," he whispered. "They are hunting." And as he stepped into the dim corridor, Watson felt that the shadow moving through the Drake residence was closer and far more dangerous than any of them had yet realized. Holmes was already moving before Watson had fully registered the sound, swift, silent, purposeful. Lestrade followed with a curse, signaling one of the constables from the hall. But Holmes paid no attention to the commotion behind him. His focus was absolute, every sense sharpened as he ascended the narrow staircase leading back toward the main floors of the house. The creak they had heard could have come from any board in the old structure, yet Holmes moved as though he knew precisely where the intruder would be. Watson felt the tension coil within him. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with unseen movement, as though the house had drawn breath and was holding it. Holmes paused at the junction where the servants' staircase met the main corridor. The faintest whisper of air drifted toward them, a movement that would have gone unnoticed by anyone less attuned than Holmes. "The study," Holmes murmured. "They've returned to it." "To what end?" Watson whispered back.
To retrieve whatever they passed through that window earlier, Holmes said, or to destroy what remains. Lestrade pushed forward. Holmes, we've men stationed. Men who guard doors, Holmes snapped softly. But not windows! Keep your voice down, Lestrade. The killer is still within earshot. They advanced with greater caution now, each step deliberate. Watson's heart thudded so loudly in his ears he feared the sound would betray them. A draught wafted down the corridor, colder, sharper, unmistakably coming from the study. Holmes raised a hand for silence. A shadow flickered beneath the study door. Holmes gave no warning. With a single fluid motion, he flung the door inward and lunged across the threshold. The study was darker than before. The lamp turned low, casting only the faintest glow across the desk. But at once, Watson saw the movement, a figure darting toward the window, a flash of dark fabric, the glint of something metallic in hand. "Stop!" Lestrade roared. The figure did not stop. Instead, they wrenched at the window latch with frantic urgency. Holmes was faster. He closed the distance with astonishing speed, seizing the intruder by the arm. A sharp cry escaped the person's lips, higher, lighter than Watson expected. "Holmes, careful!" Watson called, seeing the metallic glint resolve itself into a small blade, clutched tightly in the figure's hand. Holmes twisted the arm with expert precision. The blade clattered to the floor. Lestrade and the constable surged forward, pinning the intruder against the wall. Watson stepped nearer, breath catching as the intruder's face came suddenly into view. It was Mrs. Drake. Her dark hair had come loose, her eyes blazing with fury rather than fear. Her breath came quickly, raggedly, and the pallor in her cheeks suggested a woman driven far beyond the limits of composure. Lestrade stared at her as though seeing a ghost. "Mrs. Drake, what in heaven's name were you doing?" Holmes did not release her arm entirely, though his grip eased. "That, Inspector," Holmes said evenly, "is a question best answered once she has been relieved of any further concealed implements." Lestrade frisked her quickly. No more weapons emerged. Watson, stunned, found his voice. "Mrs. Drake, you are injured?" Her gaze snapped toward him, hostile, defiant. "I am no more injured than any woman whose home has been invaded," she hissed. "Unhand me at once." Holmes lifted an eyebrow. "Invaded is rather a strong word, madam. For a house occupied by police officers and a consulting detective you yourself summoned by proxy." She struggled again, breath coming sharply. "I heard noises. I feared the intruder had returned. I came to see—" "You came," Holmes interrupted, "to retrieve what you passed through this very window earlier this evening." Her eyes widened, a flicker, but enough. "That is a lie," she whispered. "It is a deduction," Holmes replied, "supported by evidence." He gestured toward the floor. The curtain hem near the window hung unevenly, and beneath it, half hidden by the shadow of the desk, lay a crumpled scrap of paper. Holmes stooped and retrieved it. "Inspector, be so good as to light the lamp fully." Lestrade turned up the flame, and the room brightened, revealing a hastily folded note. Holmes opened it carefully. Within lay a tiny slip of parchment, no larger than a visiting card, bearing a single line written in a bold, harsh hand: "Payment received. Silence guaranteed." Watson felt the hairs rise at the back of his neck. Holmes's eyes narrowed. A message delivered through this very window to Mrs. Drake. She shook her head violently. "I know nothing of that. You plant evidence as you please." "Indeed," Holmes said softly. "Then perhaps you were attempting to remove a message you had never seen. How curious." Her lips pressed into a thin line.
Holmes handed the message to Lestrade. "You will note the soot upon the edge. It matches the smear on the window latch. Whoever handled this card earlier tonight touched the very place Mrs. Drake attempted to open again." Lestrade looked torn between outrage and disbelief. "Madam, this is a grave matter." Mrs.
Drake lifted her chin. "Grave, yes, for all of us. My husband's death was a tragedy, and now you seek to heap shame upon the living." Holmes studied her for a long moment, his gaze penetrating yet oddly gentle. "Mrs. Drake," he said quietly, "why did your husband write to me? What danger pressed upon him so urgently that he sought my help?" Her composure faltered, a tremor passed through her lips. I do not know." Holmes stepped closer, not threatening, but commanding in presence alone. "You know enough to fear discovery," he murmured. "Enough to make you race back to this room, even at the risk of encountering the man who killed your husband. Enough to accept, or at least acknowledge, a payment for silence." Tears welled suddenly in her eyes, though Watson could not tell whether they were born of fear or fury.
"You do not understand," she whispered. "You think you see everything, Mr. Holmes, but you do not. You do not know what Percival had done, what he hid from everyone, including me." "Then enlighten me," Holmes said calmly. But she shook her head. "No, I cannot. If I speak, others will die." Holmes exchanged a sharp glance with Watson. "Others?" he repeated. Her gaze dropped to the floor. "There are men, dangerous men, who forced Percival into their schemes. He obeyed because he feared them. I kept silent because—" Her voice broke. "Because he begged me to." Holmes leaned in slightly. "And the message tonight?" "It was a warning," she whispered. "To me, to stay silent." "Or a reassurance?" Holmes murmured. "That the price of silence had been paid. A price you expected." Mrs. Drake's eyes flashed in sudden anguish. "I never wanted money. I wanted my husband safe." The room fell into taut silence. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. Watson felt the tide of the case shift in that moment, subtly but unmistakably. Holmes exhaled slowly. "Inspector, Mrs. Drake is not our killer, but she knows far more than she dares admit. And if she is fearful now, then the true architect of this crime is far more dangerous than we have yet supposed." Lestrade frowned. "Then who are we after, Holmes?" Holmes turned toward the window, the cracked pane reflecting his thoughtful gaze. "A man," he said softly, "who stalks houses in fog, who coerces respectable ship owners into criminal conspiracies, who silences servants, manipulates wives, and strikes without hesitation." He turned back, eyes gleaming with cold determination. "And if he was confident enough to send a message here tonight, then he is watching, not only this house, but us." Watson felt a cold prickle along his spine. Holmes stepped toward the door, voice low but fierce. "Inspector, this is no longer a matter of a single death. We are dealing with an organized mind, a calculating hand, and a conspiracy that reaches farther than the walls of this household." Lestrade swallowed. "What do you mean, Holmes?" Holmes paused at the doorway. "I mean," he said, "that Percival Drake was not the only one marked for silence." And Watson knew, with a sudden chilling certainty, that the fog outside concealed far more than mist and shadows. It concealed a predator. Holmes stood motionless for a moment at the threshold, his silhouette outlined faintly by the dim light in the corridor. Watson saw the familiar stillness, the gathering of thought, the sharpening of instinct, before Holmes turned back into the room with sudden purpose. "Inspector," he said, his voice low but taut, "double the guard on this house. No one, no servant, no visitor, no neighbor, is to leave or enter without your explicit permission. The killer may yet attempt to reclaim what he has lost tonight. Lestrade nodded briskly and gave quick orders to the constable. Mrs. Drake, still under restraint but no longer struggling, watched them with a kind of exhausted despair. Her hands trembled, though whether from fear or fury, Watson could not say. Holmes approached her gently, his tone shifting, no longer confrontational but measured. "Mrs. Drake, listen carefully. You are in danger, not from us, but from those who ensnared your husband. If you continue to conceal the truth, you place yourself directly in the path of the very men your husband sought to escape." She squeezed her eyes shut, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You do not understand," she whispered. "I am bound by a promise. Percival made me swear it, swear never to reveal his dealings. He said our lives depended on it." Holmes' expression softened, though the steely focus beneath it remained. "And now he is dead," he said quietly. "His enemies have not kept their side of whatever bargain he struck. The only protection you possess now lies in revealing the truth. Only sunlight, Mrs. Drake, can dispel a shadow of this magnitude." She trembled, but she did not speak. Lestrade took a step forward. "Madame, withholding information in a murder inquiry—" Holmes lifted a hand sharply. "No, Inspector."
Pressure will not loosen a tightened mind. Let her breathe. Fear is a vice. Release softens it. He turned to Watson, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can do no more with her now. Her fear is genuine and deeply rooted. We must seek the next thread from another." They stepped into the dim corridor again, leaving Mrs. Drake under watch. Lestrade followed, frowning in frustration. "So where does this lead us, Holmes? You say the killer is someone in the house, but she is not the murderer. Harker is dead and the others swear innocence." Holmes paused at the top of the stairs. "Consider the butler's last words," he murmured. "In the house?" "Not of the house, Inspector." Watson blinked. "You mean someone who entered the house but does not belong to it?" "Or someone who belongs to no one," Holmes replied. "A phantom moving in fog."
Slipping through windows, bribing or coercing with equal ease, a man whose presence leaves the faintest imprint, yet whose influence is unmistakable. Lestrade threw up his hands. "And how do we find such a man?" "We do not. He reveals himself," Holmes said, "when forced." He began descending the stairs, his movements controlled, his gaze distant. "Watson," he said softly, "tell me what you recall of the message we found." "Payment received, silence guaranteed," Watson repeated. Holmes nodded. A simple statement, yet revealing. Guaranteed silence is only promised when one fears the opposite, noise. Someone believed Mrs. Drake might speak, so they paid her. But the moment Harker suggested otherwise by hinting the killer remained within, the decision was made to silence him. Lestrade grunted. "If you're suggesting Harker was part of this—" "I am suggesting," Holmes interrupted, "that Harker knew something crucial, enough to warrant poison, enough for the killer to risk slipping back into a house filled with police." Watson shuddered. "A desperate man." "Or a careful one," Holmes murmured. "Desperation breeds mistakes, but tonight our phantom made none." They reached the ground floor. Holmes stood very still near the doorway, eyes scanning the hall, noting each detail as though seeing the house anew. "Do you smell that, Watson?" Watson inhaled. "Nothing unusual? Furniture polish? Lamp oil?" "And tar," Holmes whispered. "Faint, but present." Watson frowned, and then it clicked. "Tar. From a shipyard?" Holmes nodded. "A maritime scent, stronger near the door, as though someone brushed past recently. Combine this with Spence's testimony about Drake's business entanglements and the reference to illegal cargo, and the killer is connected to the docks," Watson finished. A man accustomed to the river, Holmes agreed. A smuggler, perhaps, or someone higher in the chain, someone whose hands are not supposed to touch contraband at all. Lestrade scratched his head. If he's from the docks, he may have already slipped away. Holmes's lips curved in a thin smile. No, Inspector, not tonight. He was here after Harker's death, just minutes ago. He would not risk crossing the city in fog so thick it might hide him, but would just as easily see him stumble into a constable's arms. No, he's close. Watson felt a cold tension coil in the air. Holmes stepped to the front door and placed his hand near the knob, not touching, but sensing. "Warm," he murmured. "Someone stood here recently. Listening?" Lestrade motioned for his men. "Spread out. Check every room." "No," Holmes said sharply. "That will warn him." Lestrade stared. "Then what do you propose?" Holmes turned slowly, his eyes gleaming with sudden clarity. "We must set a trap." Watson drew closer. "What sort of trap, Holmes?" "One baited with exactly what our phantom fears," Holmes said. "Truth." He began pacing, each step more energized than the last. "The killer believes Mrs. Drake has information enough to endanger him. He believes she may speak. And he knows that Harker died moments after whispering a warning. The killer must assume, rightly, that she may be next." Watson inhaled sharply. "You mean to suggest—" "Yes," Holmes said. "We must make him think Mrs. Drake is going to confess."
That she will reveal his name. And when he believes she's about to expose him, he will come for her, Watson finished grimly. Holmes nodded. And when he does, we shall be waiting. Lestrade's face lit with grim satisfaction. "Holmes, that's dangerous, but sound. How do we proceed?" Holmes's reply was soft, but the resolve beneath it was unmistakable. "We move Mrs. Drake to a secure room. We spread word, subtly, that she has begun to talk. We dim the lights and leave the hall quiet. And then," his eyes sharpened like blades, "we watch." Watson felt a tremor of unease, not from fear of the killer, but from the deadly intelligence that had begun to shape into a plan. Holmes turned toward the staircase again. "Let the fog cloak the streets," he murmured. "Tonight, we use it to catch the man who walks within it." Watson followed, heart pounding as the house seemed to darken around them. Somewhere in the shadows, the killer still moved, and Holmes intended to draw him out by forcing him to strike. The house seemed to shrink into itself as preparations began, as though its walls sensed that something unseen prowled among them. Lestrade moved quickly to assign constables to key posts, but Holmes halted him before more than 2 orders were given. "No uniforms near the upper floor," Holmes instructed. "Our quarry must believe the household has grown lax, comfortable, reassured. If he suspects a trap, he will vanish into the fog and not resurface until long after the trail has grown cold." Lestrade scowled but complied. Holmes, already climbing the stairs, beckoned Watson to follow. "We must choose the room with care," Holmes murmured.
"Somewhere isolated enough to appear vulnerable, yet offering us positions of concealment." They moved softly down the corridor until Holmes paused before a narrow guest chamber near the end of the hall. It was sparsely furnished, a modest bed, a single dressing table, heavy drapes along the window. A faint draught whispered through the gap beneath the door. "This will do," Holmes said. "Remove that lamp, Watson. Leave the room nearly dark, just enough glow to suggest a lone occupant." Watson did as instructed, placing one of the small lamps on the floor and lowering its flame until only a pale circle of light touched the carpet. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Bring Mrs. Drake." Moments later, 2 constables escorted her toward the chamber, She appeared subdued now, drained of whatever volatile strength had driven her earlier actions. When she saw Holmes, a flicker of anxiety crossed her features. "Must I stay alone?" she asked. "After everything that has happened?" Holmes's voice gentled, though its firmness remained. "Only for a short time. And you shall not be alone. Not truly. Watson and I will be close by, unseen. But for this trap to spring, the killer must believe you are isolated." Her eyes widened with mingled fear and dawning understanding. "You mean to use me as bait?" Holmes did not deny it. "You are in danger regardless, Mrs. Drake. This way you are protected, closely guarded, if invisibly so. Trust me when I say this will end the pursuit." She hesitated only a moment longer before giving a small, trembling nod. Lestrade guided her into the room. Holmes followed, adjusting the curtains, inspecting the latch, ensuring nothing would betray their presence. When all was ready, Holmes beckoned Watson and Lestrade back into the corridor. "She will sit by the bed," Holmes said softly. "The lamp's glow will make her silhouette faintly visible from the hall. The killer, once he believes she is speaking, will strike quickly." Lestrade frowned. "And how do we convince him she is talking?" Holmes reached into his pocket and withdrew a small paper he had prepared earlier. With swift strokes, he wrote a message. "Mrs. Drake confesses. Name to be given shortly." He folded it and pressed it into Lestrade's hand. "Leave this near the study," Holmes said. "Not in plain sight, tucked within the doorframe, as though carelessly dropped by an officer. Our phantom will be watching. He will find it." Lestrade hurried away. Holmes turned back to Watson. "We take opposite positions," he murmured. "I along the wardrobe wall. There is shadow enough for concealment. You behind the drapery by the window. Do not move until I give the signal." Watson nodded, heart pounding. The corridor had grown unnaturally quiet. Even the distant murmurs of the constables below seemed swallowed by the thickening fog outside the house. Holmes eased the door to the guest room open once more. Mrs. Drake sat on the edge of the bed, exactly where she'd been placed, hands clasped tightly, her posture stiff with dread. Holmes crouched beside her. "At no point will you be unprotected," he whispered. "If you hear movement, do not speak unless I instruct it. Trust that Watson and I are near." She gave a small, jerking nod. Holmes slipped into his chosen hiding place, and Watson crept behind the heavy drape. The room dimmed as Holmes turned the lamp wick even lower. Only a faint sliver of light stretched across the carpet, barely illuminating the shape of Mrs. Drake upon the bed. Then silence settled, deep, oppressive, almost tangible. Seconds passed, then minutes. Watson strained his ears. The soft creak of the house, the distant hum of fog-muffled traffic, the faint rustle of fabric as Mrs. Drake shifted nervously, every sound seemed amplified. Holmes remained utterly still. Watson could not see him, but he could feel his presence, sharp and alert. Then, faint but unmistakable, a soft footfall in the corridor. Mrs. Drake stiffened. Watson's breath caught. Another step, slow, careful, nearer. A shadow passed beneath the gap of the door. Watson saw it flicker, then disappear, then return as the intruder drew closer. Holmes did not move.
The handle began to turn ever so slightly. Mrs. Drake inhaled sharply. Watson pressed himself into the drapery, every nerve screaming to act, yet he held still. The door eased open no more than 2 inches. A sliver of the dim corridor appeared. Then a hand, pale, slender, gloved, slipped inside and pushed the door wider. The silhouette that emerged was not what Watson expected. Not large, not brutish, but lithe, deliberate. A dark coat, a low-brimmed hat obscuring the face. and in the intruder's right hand a length of cord, looped and ready. Mrs. Drake gasped. Watson nearly leapt forward, but Holmes's low whisper sliced through the tension. "Not yet." The intruder advanced, silent as a ghost, intent fixed solely upon the trembling woman on the bed. Another step. Another. Holmes whispered again, barely audible.
"Now!" He moved with explosive precision, launching from the shadows like a striking hawk. Watson tore free from the drapes at the same instant. Lestrade burst in from the hall. The intruder spun, fluid as quicksilver, attempting to bolt for the corridor. But Holmes intercepted, grappling the figure and wrenching the concealed weapon free. Watson rushed forward to assist, but Holmes had already forced the attacker to the floor. Lestrade pinned the arms as Holmes tore away the brimmed hat. Watson froze. The face revealed was neither monstrous nor thuggish. It was a man of perhaps 30, lean and sharp-eyed, with the unmistakable pallor of one accustomed to working at night and in secrecy. Holmes's voice cut through the stunned silence. "Mr. Adrian Spence, I presume?" Watson's shock deepened. Spence, whom they had questioned earlier, who had professed shock at Drake's death. Spence's lips curled into a cold, thin smile. "You should have left it alone, Holmes." Holmes' expression hardened. A man who moves in shadows and lies through his teeth, who earns the trust of ship owners and ruins them for profit, who manipulates their households to ensure silence. I seldom leave such men alone. Spence gave a low, bitter laugh. "You know nothing." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, tightening his grip. "I know you coerced Drake into your smuggling ring. I know you threatened him when he wished to withdraw. And I know that when he dared to seek help, my help, you silenced him." Watson felt a cold wave wash over him. "And now," Holmes continued, his voice quiet yet deadly, "you intended to silence his wife." Spence breathed heavily, eyes darting, calculating. But there was no escape now. Constables flooded the corridor, and Lestrade hauled him upright in irons. Holmes stood slowly, dusting his hands. "Inspector," he said, "you now have your murderer." Spence glared. "A murderer, perhaps, but not the architect. You have no idea who you challenge." Holmes's expression darkened with interest. "Oh, I assure you," he said softly, "I intend to." And Watson knew then that the true depth of the conspiracy had only just begun to surface. Spence's words lingered in the air long after Lestrade dragged him from the room, leaving behind an echo that seemed to settle into the very walls of the Drake residence. Holmes watched him go with a stillness so profound that Watson, who had weathered countless revelations by his friend's side, recognized the depth of concentration beneath it. The case, though it had yielded a murderer, was not yet complete. For Holmes, a confession uttered in bitterness was merely the beginning of truth, not its end. Mrs. Drake, trembling violently on the edge of the bed, was assisted to her feet by Watson. She clutched his sleeve with desperate fingers. "That man," she whispered. "Mr. Spence, he was the one who pressured Percival, who threatened him." Holmes turned toward her, his expression measured. "Spence was the instrument, madam, but perhaps not the hand that guided the blade. He operated with too much confidence, too little hesitation. Such men rarely act entirely on their own." She covered her mouth with trembling fingers, as though attempting to hold back a sob that had been building for hours. Watson supported her gently, guiding her toward the hallway. Holmes walked beside them, his gaze distant, yet alert. "Tell me, Mrs. Drake, Did your husband ever speak of a partner, someone he feared more than Spence himself? She shook her head, struggling for breath. No. Only that he had made a terrible mistake, that forces greater than he had imagined were at work. He said he was trapped, that even I must not know. Ah, Holmes murmured, the secrecy of the doomed, it is often fatal. Lestrade approached from the corridor, wiping the sweat from his brow. Holmes, Spence is secured downstairs. He's refusing to speak further, claims you don't know the half of it. Holmes gave a faint, sardonic incline of the head. On that point, I dare say he is correct. Lestrade blinked. Meaning what? We've caught the man trying to strangle a witness. The motive fits. The opportunity fits. Holmes raised a single finger. Inspector, recall the message delivered earlier tonight. Payment received, silence guaranteed. Would a man like Spence, cunning though he is, guarantee silence when he was planning to kill the very recipient of that message only hours later? No, Spence was a servant of fear, a pawn, but not the one who paid the fee. He had urgency, not authority. Watson saw Lestrade's certainty falter. Holmes continued softly, We must look beyond him. Mrs. Drake sagged in Watson's grip. Holmes knelt briefly before her, his voice gentler now. Madam, your ordeal is nearly over, but I must ask one final question. Did your husband handle any correspondence recently that was unusual? Any letter he kept hidden, any name he reacted to strongly? She hesitated, pressing a hand to her temple. Watson feared she might faint, but she steadied herself. There was one thing, she said slowly. A letter arrived 3 days ago. Percival burned it almost at once, but I saw one word before he threw it into the fire. Holmes's eyes gleamed. What word? Adelaide. Holmes rose in a single fluid motion, all softness gone. Watson, Spence mentioned a ship just hours ago, the Adelaide Star. It was the vessel linked to the contraband scandal. If that ship was central to Drake's fear, then its owners, or those who profited most from its illicit use, must stand at the core of this conspiracy. Lestrade scratched his head. And who owns the Adelaide Star now? Holmes fixed him with a cool gaze. Find that out, Inspector, immediately. Before Lestrade could hurry off, Holmes added sharply, and ensure the name is not leaked, and the mastermind will vanish the instant he senses we are near. Lestrade nodded grimly and departed. Holmes motioned Watson and Mrs. Drake toward the stairs. We must return her to her room, he said. Her safety is imperative now that the killer knows his attempt has failed. As they escorted her, the house seemed quieter, not calmer, but waiting. Mrs. Drake paused at her doorway, turning to Holmes with pleading eyes. Will this ever end? Holmes regarded her with solemn gravity. It ends when truth overpowers fear, and fear, madam, is already weakening. She entered her room under guard, and Watson followed Holmes back downstairs. As they reached the lower hall, the fog outside pressed against the windows like a living creature. Holmes stood near the front door, his expression locked in thought. Watson approached cautiously. You believe Spence acted under orders, Watson said. Undoubtedly, Holmes replied. He is unscrupulous but not reckless. Tonight's actions were impulsive, driven by desperation, evidence that someone greater has abandoned him. Spence knows too much. He is expendable. Watson frowned. Then if the true architect senses we are close, might he attempt to escape? Holmes gave a thin, grim smile. Watson, a man who commands a network of illicit shipments, who silences shipowners through fear, who employs men like Spence to do his bidding, such a man does not run into fog. He dissolves into it. Watson shivered. And what of the message Spence alluded to? That we challenge someone beyond him? Holmes's eyes hardened. It confirms the mastermind fears confrontation, not with the Yard, but with knowledge. Our only task now is to identify him before he erases every trace. A constable hurried up to them, breathless. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade asks you to come at once. He's found something in the study, something about the Adelaide Star." Holmes shot Watson a swift look. The fire of deduction burned bright in his eyes. "Come, Watson," he said as he strode for the stairs. "We are approaching the heart of this labyrinth." They entered the study once more to find Lestrade standing by the desk, holding a thin ledger. The ink on its spine was cracked, as though well used and often hidden. Holmes took it, flipped through its pages, and stopped abruptly. Watson watched the transformation, Holmes' expression tightening, sharpening, until his eyes glittered like steel under lamplight. "This," Holmes murmured, "is no ordinary ledger. It is an account of clandestine shipments, routes, docking times, payments, aliases." Lestrade stepped closer. "And who signs them?" Holmes turned the book toward them. At the bottom of several entries written in the same crisp hand was a name Watson recognized instantly. Adrian Spence, but beside it, initials Watson had never seen. "MC," he whispered. Holmes closed the ledger slowly. "Not only Spence, a partner, one who remained hidden until now." Lestrade frowned. "Do we know who MC is?" Holmes's voice lowered to a razor's whisper. "Oh, yes," he said. "Percival Drake knew. He tried to tell us, first in his telegram, then in the message he hoped I'd read. But Spence reached him first." Watson's breath caught. "Holmes, who is MC?" Holmes turned toward the window, where the fog pressed thick against the cracked pane. His profile was cut like iron in the dim light. "MC," he said, "is the man responsible for the entire affair, the one Spence fears." He turned back, voice now steady, cold, and certain. "And tomorrow, Watson, we shall unmask him." Watson felt a chill thrill of anticipation. The case, though nearing its end, had one final veil to lift, and Sherlock Holmes stood ready to tear it aside. The fog had thinned by morning, though the city still lay beneath a pale shroud of mist that seemed to echo the tension of the night before. Holmes had slept scarcely an hour, if he had slept at all, but when Watson entered the sitting-room at Baker Street, he found his friend standing at the window, hands clasped behind him, the ledger from the Drake study open upon the table. Holmes did not turn as Watson approached. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "all the pieces lie before us, each correct, each placed with purpose. Yet the picture remained incomplete because we assumed a hierarchy that never existed." Watson frowned, taking a seat. "You mean Spence was not the mastermind?" "Precisely. Spence was the visible blade, sharpened and wielded by another hand entirely. The initials MC, the final veil. And I now know who wears it." Holmes snapped the ledger shut and reached for his coat. "Lestrade awaits us at Scotland Yard with Spence in custody. Come, Watson, the truth must now be spoken plainly." Their cab rattled through the awakening city, past newsboys shouting headlines and shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds. Yet even as London shook off its slumber, Holmes remained taut as a drawn bowstring, silent, calculating. Lestrade met them in his office, his expression a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "Holmes, I've looked at every registered ship owner, every dockmaster, every merchant with those initials. None fit." Holmes lifted a hand. "That is because the identity is neither a dockmaster nor a merchant. MC to me is a man who profits without ever stepping foot on a pier." Lestrade stared. "Well, who is he then?" Holmes's voice dropped. "Martin Carroway." Watson started. "Carroway? But he is one of the most respected financiers in London." Respected, Holmes said with a faint, icy smile, because he hides behind men like Spence, behind respectable shipowners like Drake. Carraway has funded contraband ventures for years, using the Adelaide Star as his flagship. Drake discovered the truth too late, and when he tried to withdraw, Carraway threatened him. The letter Drake burned bore Carraway's name. Until yesterday, that name remained concealed even from Spence. Lestrade blinked. And you can prove this? Holmes tapped the ledger. Carraway's handwriting. He is careless with his flourishes. A double curve on every C, a sharp downward stroke on M. Compare it to his signature in the financial archives and you will find a match. Lestrade's eyes widened. By heaven! Holmes, if this is true, it brings down half the East India Docks with it. Holmes nodded, which is precisely why he employed Spence as his intermediary, and why Spence attempted to silence both Harker and Mrs. Drake. Carraway knew the chain was fraying. Lestrade left at once, barking orders to assemble a team for Carraway's arrest. Holmes and Watson accompanied them to the financier's stately residence in Knightsbridge, a towering building of stone and quiet power. Holmes did not knock. He strode inside with Lestrade, past startled servants, and into a richly panelled study where Martin Carraway stood behind a mahogany desk, perfectly composed, as though he had expected them. He lifted a brow. Mr. Holmes, Inspector, to what do I owe this intrusion? Holmes regarded him with calm detachment. To murder, sir, and to a conspiracy that has claimed its final victim. Carraway's expression did not change, but something tightened around his eyes. Murder is a strong word, he said coolly. Not as strong as poison, Holmes replied, or strangulation, or the firing of a pistol into the temple of a man who had discovered too much. Carraway's mask slipped, only for an instant, but Watson saw it, a flicker of cold calculation. Lestrade produced the ledger. Your initials, your accounts, your payments to Spence? Carraway's gaze hardened. Forgery. Holmes stepped forward, placing a gloved finger lightly upon the desk. Then perhaps you would explain why the page detailing the Adelaide Star was torn from your own personal business journal. Drake had confided a copy to a solicitor, one found just this morning. Watson admired the lie for what it was, clean, precise, devastating. No such journal had been found, but Carraway could not know that. Carraway's breath caught. Holmes's voice remained soft, almost polite. The moment Drake sought my assistance, you feared exposure? You dispatched Spence to silence him, but men like Spence are loyal only to fear, not to masters, and your fear, Carraway, has now betrayed you. Carraway lunged for the drawer. Too late. Lestrade's men wrestled him to the floor, extracting a loaded revolver from his grasp. Lestrade snapped the cuffs shut. Martin Carraway, you are under arrest for the murder of Percival Drake and for conspiracy in the smuggling and distribution of illegal goods. Carraway stared up at Holmes with baleful hatred. You meddling devil! You've ruined empires you cannot even comprehend. Holmes looked down at him with an expression of quiet finality. Sir, any empire built upon fear collapses the moment one man chooses to speak. When Carraway was taken away, Watson released a breath he had not realized he was holding. Holmes adjusted his gloves, the tension bleeding out of him in faint increments. Well, Watson, he said lightly, another day, another labyrinth. Watson shook his head. Holmes, the way you wove it all together, the note, the ledger, the window, Spence. Holmes waved a hand dismissively. Elementary. But Watson caught the edge of satisfaction in his eyes. Later, at 221B, as they settled before the hearth with the fog lifting beyond the window, Watson turned to him. Holmes, do you think Mrs. Drake will find peace now? Holmes's gaze softened a fraction. She will grieve, Watson, but she will not be hunted. That at least is justice. Watson let the warmth of the fire sink into him. And you, Holmes? Will you rest now? Holmes reached for his violin, drawing the bow across the strings in a contemplative chord. There is always another puzzle, my dear Watson, he said with a faint, enigmatic smile. But for tonight, let us allow London a moment of quiet. And as the music filled the room, weaving through the thinning fog beyond Baker Street, Watson reflected, as he always did, that no man alive could match the brilliance, the resolve, or the relentless pursuit of truth embodied in Sherlock Holmes. And thus concluded the case of the man who was killed before Holmes arrived, a mystery solved, justice restored, and the deductive mind of Holmes once more triumphant.